I feel like a bit like a lead singer in a boy band. Maybe we should have had a woman in the panel, because they're better at cleaning up the mess than what men are. Anyway, to move on. My panel here, Michael Steinoff to the left of me. Michael is yacht building manager for Hiswa. That's the Holland Marine Industry Group. Michael started his career in the marine industry 26 years ago, after working for a decade as sales manager for companies in the field of navigation and communication equipment. He made a switch to Hiswa and is section manager responsible for the yacht building department. Nowadays, he also combines working for Hiswa with his role as a secretary for the Innovation Council for Maritime Holland. It's a joint initiative, and it involves 12,000 companies who power the maritime sector in Holland. So Michael's not satisfied with one job, he wants to do two, so that's always good news. To my right, Albert Williamson. Albert is the environmental manager with ICOMIA, which is the International Confederation of Marine Industry Associations. Always very difficult to say, but I managed it today. Albert was educated and qualified as an engineer, originally working in the aerospace industry and then the automotive sector before getting involved with boating in the 80s. From there, he developed a strong interest in marine environmental issues, but he's always looked at them from a trained engineer's perspective. So Albert brings 30 years of experience to this panel and to his job with ICOMIA. And the important thing is he spends a lot of time looking at government legislation, which, of course, we're going to get involved with this subject at some stage. So Albert's expertise and experience with legislation will become very important for us. And I'm sure he's going to give us some details on that this afternoon. I hope he is. Willem Dekker, second from my left here. Willem is president of the European Boating Association. And that's a really important role because Willem represents millions of boat users and boat owners. These are the guys in Europe that have to face the problem of one day that their boat will reach end of life. And therefore, they're probably the most important people in this whole equation. So it's nice to have Willem here representing those important people, of which I am one, I'm glad to say. After he retired from the Dutch Navy, Willem served as a marine engineering officer. And after that, he took up a number of voluntary jobs, mainly associated with water sports. For 6 years, he was a board member of the Royal Netherlands Yachting Union, and he got involved there with various recreational waterways projects, which were all aimed at improving conditions for water sports. Willem is a keen yachtsman, which is always good news because he must have a good interest in this subject. And he sails what he calls his classic plastic 26-foot long keeler on the local Dutch waters. So he has an indestructible sailing boat.
Absolutely. 38 years old.
38 years old, he tells me. So still a young boat. And then on the far left here, we have Enrico Banco. Enrico is director of a company called Go Sailing for a Change, or in short, GS4G. It's a lovely name, man. Go Sailing for a Change. I like that. Or what about going sailing permanently and giving up work? But okay, no, that was the idea. Yeah, okay. Enrico was halfway through a very professional career, including an America's Cup campaign and lecturing in digital media in London. When he decided to found GS4G. And with his partners, he's devoted the last few years to scouting innovative, sustainable technologies and networking with other companies in the composites business to figure out the necessary steps to achieve zero landfill composite manufacturing. Now that's really important in the context of what we're speaking about here, as you will learn later, because fiberglass, as we know, is pretty well indestructible. So they're continuing on a path to try and create a circular economy for the boating industry. The circular economy is talked about a lot these days. It's the way forward for our environment, that's for sure, where we make sure that our entire production process comes back in a loop. And that's exactly what Enrico and his colleagues are involved in. Last but not least, on this end, to my right, is Boy van Baars. Boy is director and founder of Stichting Yacht Recycling, which I believe means Yacht Recycling Foundation. My Dutch is not very good, I'm afraid. Boy is a professional yacht surveyor. He's been a seagoing officer, and he's worked in the Dutch yachting industry at some of the best known yards around in the technical capacity. He's also a keen sailor, so we have some sailors on board here. And he takes a professional interest in international rules and regulations for recreational craft. In the course of his work, what Boy has noticed with his partners over the last few years is that there's more and more end-of-life recreational craft being noticed. So he sat down with his partner a few years ago and decided they're trying to do something about it. And what he's trying to do is create a sustainable recycling industry that can successfully evolve. And part of that sustainability is to make sure that it's economical for the industry. So that's my panel. And I'd like to thank them all for being here. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending. We have a few people in. Do we have anybody amongst this huge crowd from a boat building company? Or naval architects? No. Marinas? Marine insurance? No. Okay. I think the point I'm trying to make is that, as Kim said, we had very, very good conference yesterday. Lots of people in the industry were there. Most of them are engaged in trying to find solutions to this problem. But our keynote speaker, Carla De Maria, ended with a very nice short slide. And what she said is, we need to join hands. This problem that's announced quite clearly here has been going on for far too long. Our industry needs to recognise it and take action, and we're only going to do that if we have everybody in the industry playing their part and joining hands in a collaborative project. In a nutshell, what we have is the perfect tsunami. I think it says that up there somewhere. During the 70s and 80s, fiberglass boats were being built in large volumes. There were times when money was relatively cheap. People felt relatively affluent. Large volumes of boats were built. And in fact, during my research, I was told that the guy that started Sea Ray Boats, Connie Ray, built his first 19-foot day boat in 1959. But before that, he was building coffins from fiberglass. And the whole reason he saw to build a boat from it is he could bury it in the ground and it would never rot. Well, guess what? We've made boats now that we bury in the ground and they never rot. So Connie went on to develop this huge fiberglass boat manufacturing industry. He's one of the pioneers of it. And as I said, through the 70s and 80s, we got a huge amount of boats being built, which we now have to deal with because the critical period appears to be around 40 years when these boats reach end-of-life stage. Now, the other thing that's come out in our discussions yesterday is that you can call it end of life, but you can also call it end of use. It's not always because the boat is falling apart. It's sometimes because the owner is fed up with it, he can't afford it any longer, maybe the engine's problems, maybe the sails are worn out. Whole kind of things that can happen which bring it to the end of use, and it doesn't have a market for resale any longer. So there's two possible reasons here these boats reach the end of life, but it normally happens around 40 years. Now, the other statistic, which I think you might be interested in before I hand over to my panel, I was asked a couple of weeks ago to look at the number of boats that are actually involved, because people want to hang a number on this. How many boats are we actually talking about? So I spent a weekend delving into a load of research material, and there are no reliable global statistics for all the boats in the world, but there's lots that you can put together from different sources. And I came up with a figure of 40 million recreational boats in the world. And that's fairly accurately based on registration figures from America, Canada, Europe, etc., and some studies that have been done. And a very good survey that was done here a little bit earlier in the year was identifying that the fleet here in Holland, something like 0.5% per year over the next 5 years will reach end of life, and the ensuing 5 years, 1% per year. So if you take a worldwide fleet of 40 million, and you take 0.5% of that for the next 5 years, That's 200,000 boats a year. And then the following 5 years, that'll be doubled. So actually, you're talking about 3 million boats, potentially, that could reach end of life in the next decade. And that's based on a conservative estimate, because these boats are normally family-sized boats. We're not talking about canoes and dinghies and skiffs and rowing boats. So you can probably add a figure to that. But let's call it 3 million. What happens if those 3 million boats are not disposed of in the correct way? Well, we've all seen it. They get dumped on beaches, they get sunk in canals, they get left rotting in marinas, they create a bad image for our industry, they pollute the seas, and most importantly, or as importantly, they stop the future growth of our industry, because you can't sell new boats if the old ones are clogging up the marinas and spoiling the image of our industry. So for me, this is a really fundamental, important issue. It's all about how we progress, make our industry grow. Our motto is dealing with the future of industry by dealing with its past. And that's what we're trying to do here. So I'm going to stop now. I think I've given you a bit of a background to why we're here and the importance of the subject. I think I'd like to turn first to Willem. Yeah, firstly, is there any questions from the audience? Sorry. We're delighted to have questions. No? No? Yes, sir.
Are there any boat recycling programs in existence now?
Yes, there are. And these were covered quite comprehensively in our conference yesterday. I think the one that's probably best to mention, there are quite a few actually, but there's been one established in France since 2009. The French have recycled 4,000 boats since that scheme was set up. They have 50 collection points around the coast of France, run by about 26 companies, I think, in total. So they have a system that's actually working there. The interesting thing is the guy that presented it yesterday told us that for every 10 quotes he puts out, he gets 1 accepted. So the other 9 boats are not being disposed of in the correct way, and that's a major problem for our industry. But I think I'll let Boy comment on that as well.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, the French do have a system that works. Here in Holland, we don't have a complete system. There are, I think, 3 or 4 initiatives who are recycling crafts at the moment. They are not cooperating well together. It's very spread all over the country. I think when you scale these 4 companies in Holland over France, we have the same condensity of recycling companies as in France. In France it's regulated, here it's not. And I think then we get over immediately to the next stage, which was a very important thing yesterday, and that's the cost and the viability of yacht recycling industry at the moment. The numbers Peter just told is more or less the same here in Holland. 1% of 10% of all the quotes are actually turned over in recycling projects. Here in Holland we experience that most of them are private-owned boats. People who recognize their responsibility and bring them over to, for example, us, to recycle them in a sustainable way. But it's still costly. And one of the major things yesterday was who's going to pay for recycling these boats.
Thank you. Do the major sort of charter operators, do they have systems in place, the big Sunsail, these sort of people, to end-of-life boats in their fleets? Do they have their own systems, or?
I'm not aware
simply sell them after a number of years.
Yeah. Just looking around the panel, all of us seem to have the same opinion. It doesn't seem to be happening with the charter companies, which could be a very good avenue. Enrico, I'm sure, has some comments on this.
Yes, just one quick thing. That one of the things that came up yesterday is that differentiating end of life and end of use. And we were wondering, and we were having a discussion now, and because most of the boats that are ending up in this way are small boats, we were wondering if it's the time to look at the sharing economy instead of the buying economy. I mean, this is having a big organization owning a big fleet of boats and being in control of that fleet. It will be the best way to have control and to decide when it's time to recycle. Also, that would avoid the sentimental problem. People don't recycle their boat for sentimental issues, even though they have no time to use it. But it's not like a car. A car, you buy a car and you know in 5 years you're going to sell it and give it away. You have no sentimental connection with the car. It's different with the boat. Moving the industry toward a sharing economy approach, it could also be, but we wonder, be a solution, but we wonder, is the industry ready for that? Is the audience ready for that shift?
Can I? Oh.
As a sentimental old man with an old boat, I think, to answer your question, that the charter companies must have a high quality to maintain their standards and to also make it attractive for people to charter. So I think if you look at the fleet of charter companies, you find relatively young boats. And after a number of years, they will come to the end of their use for the charter company and are being sold in the private market. I think that you find that that's mostly the case.
Can I just say an overview of the trend regarding recycling? When we first were addressed about, let's say, the issue of dismantling boats was in '89. Then the authorities were afraid of old-fashioned surfboards, who were, let's say, around, let's say, in the industry, and they are asking questions to the industry how they will dismantled, how they will be recycled. Well, at that particular moment, and that was the first country within ICOMIA, was Norway, started up and setting up the first facility of recycling, which was in '93, because they had suffering of a lot of banded boats. Followed by Japan, who started in '99 up to 2003. They set up also one facility, and that was in, let's say, operational in 2003. While in 2003, France started with let's say, with developing a system together with, let's say, the European system, which was more or less European and funded by the French authorities. And now you're seeing, let's say, becoming the time in between is more increasing, so the industry is taking more the responsibility. But one of the big issues is, if we look, let's say, international and European legislation for big ships and vessels, even for smalling fishing boats and even for naval vessels, that's in place and that's in force. But for small boats, it's still not. It's coming, it's for sure. And the date we are all expecting is 2018. And then it should be more and more and more. But in the meantime, as an industry, we have to prepare ourselves and make sure that, let's say, not only the facilities are in place, but also we have conditions for the new upcoming legislation, which is more in line with the industry than before.
Yeah, thanks, Albert. Well, it was interesting. One of the speakers we had at the conference yesterday was ARN, who are actually automotive recyclers. They recycle 85% of the vehicles here in Holland, so they've got a long track record in that particular waste stream. And they were very kind to come along and give us some advice from their hard-earned experience. And the one lesson that they thought we should really take on board is that we should, as an industry, we should get going with this sooner rather than later, so that when the legislation comes, we actually have some say in the legislation rather have something put down on us from above. And I think we all took that on board. And at the end of the day, ICOMIA decided to form a steering group and try and make that collaborative across the board so that we can all work together on this so that when the legislation that Albert mentioned comes forward in 2018, we'll be prepared to work with the authorities to make sure that it suits our industry. I think I'd like to ask Michael now to give us a few comments about the situation here in Holland, because that's his speciality. If you wouldn't mind, Michael, please.
What would you like to know?
Well, I know that from your two colleagues that were there yesterday, they're very clear, and this is really about, my question, if you like, is about who pays. And I think here's why I have a fairly clear view on it. The person that pays should be who they regard to be the polluter, who is the last owner.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what your comments are on that, whether you agree with it or whether you think it's...
Well, in Holland we don't have a system of yacht registration, so in the end we don't know whose vessel is rotting away where. So that's a starter. So we first plea for a registration system in which it's clear from who's the owner of the vessel. Yeah. Now that's a starter. And then you can think of course, who has to pay the bill for recycling it. And that also could be a kind of system which is introduced for cars as well. When you buy one, you already pay for destroying it. So I think that could be a way to find a way out of this situation, because no one is willing to pay at this moment for recycling their yacht, and because it's expensive. Yeah. And I know there have been some tests with mobile platforms to do yacht recycling, so maybe that's an opportunity. Or also, which is also a possibility, I think, is to get in line the regular yacht service companies, which could be also could be also very active in not only refitting but also do the recycling of yachts. So I think that's part of the process. So we really have to incorporate that in our business models. And I think that's also asking for a mental shift, so to speak, with the guys active in our sector.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I think the thing that's coming across clearly in this, again from a lot of the things we discussed yesterday, there's a big education process, almost a PR exercise that we have to embark on as an industry, because this has become a bit of a horror story, and we need to turn around the horror story kind of concept. The interesting thing is we looked at recycling schemes in Japan, in Norway, in Sweden, in France, and here in Holland. So we've got a pretty good cross-section of schemes that we looked at yesterday, I think you'll all agree. And the interesting thing is the actual cost is pretty well level. If you take a 10-metre boat, it costs about 1,500 euros to dispose of that in Japan or in France or here, generally speaking. So we've got a level playing field in costs. And it's not a huge amount of money. But of course, it's a lot of money to somebody who maybe 65 years old, enjoyed the last of his boat, doesn't want to see it anymore, and then has to tell his wife he's got to find 1,500 euros to get rid of it. So this is the human element that we're facing. And I think what Michael said is true. We need to find creative ways to fund it throughout the industry. It could be through marine insurance. It could be through marina funds. It could be through boat builders, including some accrual in the early days of the boat's life. There's lots of ways it could be done. But if the funding is there, then what we discovered yesterday is our industry already has solutions. We're already getting entrepreneurs that are finding ways of doing this and finding new processes. But we need to solve the funding problem. And we need to do that as an industry. That's my take on this. Yes, Ed?
Just on, you mentioned the boat builders. I was just interested to hear what the actual boat builders are doing. Are they doing anything per se? Could they be doing a lot more in terms of not just perhaps in funding some of this cost, but maybe in the way they design their boats to be easier to dismantle?
I think Albert can probably help with that.
Let's say there is an international policy which is quite clear. The policy is related to the design. So in fact you have to put a part which is prevention of pollution. Another part is reuse. Third part is recycle. And the fourth part is dispose on an environmental friendly way. So that means that the designer, when he's designing a new product, whether it's a piece of equipment, machinery, dinghies, sailing yachts, mention it, it should be such a way that he can, let's say, be in compliance with this officially international approach. At the same time, the international approach is also, let's say, that the polluter has to pay. So there's a balance in between. So if we can make very clear that, let's say, the industry is not the big polluter, but let's say can keep it such a way that we have automatically a process in force to automatically, when a boat is abandoned, that it should be taken up and recycled. That's one part. And like Peter is saying, we have a lot of different facilities, but also a different approach how to recycle. And one thing we can learn from the big ship operators is that the official legislation related to dismantling of ships has automatically also international standards, ISO standards, related to the management system, how to dismantle and how to, let's say, recycle. And that part is also missing in our industry. So what I like to do is to press more to TC8, which is responsible for the marine industry within ISO, saying set up a management scheme that we can use also for the legislators, so that the legislation coming up is in line what we can use from the recycle facilities. So it's not, let's say, waiting for a legislation or a new law, it's being proactive. And we've done it before. If you look, let's say, at sound and exhaust emissions within our industry, that was lobbied by us in the beginning of the 90s. It's now integrated in the RCD. And we did it also with wastewater systems. We had lobbying for wastewater systems because we don't want wastewater systems in marinas, which is very expensive. No, we want a simple solution based on experience here in the Netherlands and Germany, and they accepted it. So you have to be proactive, not waiting, not sitting down, and also an international group working together and the same approach in one phase to one direction.
Thanks, Albert. I think that's a very good point. Michael?
Can I add something to that?
Please do, yeah.
That's because your remark, Ed, about the design. I think that's very important, and that's called design to recycle. And I think for the future, that's something we really have to look at, to see how we build the next generation of boats, and how we're going to dismantle them in the end. So I think that's a big opportunity also for the business, for the industry, to look at that part, and not only being busy with how to get rid of the old stuff, but also how do we prevent to get the same problem or even more in the future. So that's a very important item, I think.
Yeah. I'd like to ask Enrico to make a point on this, because he's specialising in this very subject. So I'm sure he has something to say.
Yeah, there is a very important part of design for disassembling, and we are trying to talk to, and we're set up a project right now, and it has been sent for the LIFE funding project for the European Union, about building a boat that is designed for being disassembled. But the idea is not to prove that this is just cheaper to disassemble, but also cheaper to assemble. And that is the way to get boat yards on board and manufacturers on board, because if you just add a tax on them for the disassembling side of it, that is not getting them on your side. You need to prove that if they build the boat in a certain way, is it going to be cheaper for them and faster for them to build, so that they can make more money to begin with. And then it will be also incidentally cheaper to disassemble, because one of the things that was very obvious yesterday during the conference is that the sorting time is taking most of the energy that goes into disassembling and recycling a boat.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point. And I think I'd like to reiterate again, and hopefully we'll get friends involved that ICOMIA know from the naval architecture and yacht design side, because I know, for instance, companies like Freepack here in Holland are working hard on looking at ways of building boats very differently in the future. And we need to get those guys involved in this process as well, so they can give us their input, and we can we can encourage them with showing the problems of the past and how get them to avoid them in the future for us. We don't want to be in this same situation in 10 years' time, that's for sure.
Can I get one more question?
Please do it.
What are the marinas doing about it? What's their take? Because obviously they've got a vested interest in clearing all these boats that are littering the marinas and preventing income.
Our experience is that the marinas, they have several problems with these boats. Most of the boats that are at marinas are the abandoned boats. The boats that are just left behind. So the marinas have the first problem that they are not earning money by the mooring that's rented to them. At the end they are stuck with the end of life cycle boats, and as long as they are built from wood or steel, the problem is not so big. Of course you have the expropriation of the boat, that's a big concern for the marinas. But all the fiber reinforced boats, they have to pay money to get rid of the boat. So they do have loss of income because the boats are abandoned. They got an image problem because these wrecks, more or less wrecks, are lying around. And in the end they have to pay to get rid of these boats. They don't want to pay for the polluter is paying. They don't want to pay for the responsibility for someone else. In the end, they have to pay because they have to get rid of these boats, and that's a problem. So the lesson I learned from the convention yesterday, it's my personal opinion, is that we had a little bit of discussion before this discussion half an hour ago. It is necessary to create a fund, European-wide, at least European-wide, in which a certain amount of money is put in, so that, for example, marinas or also waterway authorities can use this fund to take care of these end-of-life cycle boats, so that not only they are left with the problems of the polluters. Because I think, it's a good question, I think that the biggest problem is for marinas and waterway authorities, because they are stuck with the end-of-life cycle boats when they are abandoned.
If I could add just a small point to that, again, that we learned yesterday from the Spanish marine industry representative, Jose Luis Fejo. In Spain, they've had a problem with marinas, a lot of boats being abandoned. What they're having to do is sit down with their legal experts and find a way that they can put together a legal structure which allows the marinas to dispose of those boats, because right at the moment the boat can sit there, not paid for, rotting away for several months, and if the marina decides to dispose of it, the owner can still come back and claim against them. So that is a problem that has to be dealt with. Now I know I lived in Palma de Mallorca for a number of years, and I know in Palma, which is, Mallorca is quite a small island, they've actually changed their legislation already. And they've allowed the marinas, if the boat is not paid for and abandoned for a period of 3 months, they can legally dispose of it. So that's probably going to happen in other parts of the world as well, because that is a legal issue which has got nothing to do with the technical issue, but it is a problem for marinas. And you can imagine how frustrating it is for them. No income and the boat just sitting there.
How much of the material is actually recyclable? And how much of it ends up in a landfill?
Well, what we learned yesterday is that basically all of it can be recycled. I mean, it's just a matter of choosing the technology. And the problem is, again, dismantling the boat, disassembling and sorting the different materials. That is where most of the energy goes. From our point of view, what we are trying to work on is to work on a zero landfill manufacturing process. So changing the fiber, changing the resin, so that we can recover everything from to begin with. So I was giving an example yesterday on a wind blade, just because we have numbers, on a wind blade that is about 2 tons. Just before hitting the turbine, the wind blade sends about 500 kilos of waste to landfill. So we need to work on that side of it. Also, because this is a problem that manufacturer has immediate. That is a relevant problem to the manufacturer. Now, emptying the bin of the manufacturer is something, and reconverting that into something that can go back into the composite value chain, that is already a first step, not to be sitting here in 10 years having the same problem. Now, and again, the manufacturing waste is something, as the molds, I mean, is something that hasn't been considered yet. I mean, we're just considering end of life of boats. And circular economy is mainly talking about end of life. That is not something immediately relevant to the manufacturer. So we need to work on that too. Also, consider that maybe cheap fiberglass is not the best solution. That is also something that we should consider. I mean, using a material that is not worth recycling economically maybe is not a really good idea. And maybe it's time to look at new technologies. Other sectors, the construction industry has moved on forward. Cement made massive step on, so it could be a solution maybe for molds, and the recycling chain for cement, and using textile reinforced cement for concrete, for example, for molds, could be a solution, as there is already a value chain for the recycling set up from the construction industry. I'm just throwing things here, but
if I can add a little to that, technically, almost everything is recyclable. The question is, what are the costs of recycling the materials, and what's the value that we get back from the raw materials? And that's a real issue with fiber reinforced plastics, because the fiber itself is cheap already in a not recycled state. You can imagine when it is recycled and is recovered from a boat or a windmill or whatever, a wind turbine, the value is even lower. So technically, we discovered yesterday that technically recycling a boat is possible, but it is expensive and the value of the materials is low. Then to go back to your question about designing the boats, we get back to that same situation again. Is it still viable to build boats that are difficult to recycle? There are a lot of programs about recycling reinforced plastics, but they are mainly focused on clean fiber reinforced polymers. If we look at boats, we have a lot more than fiber reinforced plastics. We have composite materials, we have laminated chain plates, we have stainless steel inside these boats, which makes the dismantling process also expensive.
Coatings, antifoulings, epoxies, lining tanks, all these things make it very difficult to recycle the composite because you have to make it clean first. The other thing I think I should just mention, which again came out of yesterday's discussions, is that the logistics is a large part of the cost on this. If you take the average cost of recycling a boat, then 30% of that cost is actually the logistics of getting it to where you need it. So this is something we have to take into consideration when we're talking about setting up recycling facilities in the future, the cost of getting the boat there. How are we for time? Yeah, please.
I think in view of your question on the recycling of GRP boats, the example that was given by Enrico is true for clean waste and also pure waste. One of the problems they're facing with the recycling process to bring it back to GRP and resin is that they cannot deal with impurities too well at this moment. And I would like to stress that the recovery cost of this material is indeed, as was just said, so high in comparison to what the market value of the core material is, that it is economically not viable. So that's one of the problems that we are facing from a user's point of view. Because if I may answer to what was said by my right-hand neighbor, and speaking for the international community, the last user does not easily accept that all the cost of recycling should fall onto him. And when you talk about a polluter, and that was brought up in yesterday's conference as well, a polluter can be anybody who touches the stuff. So, you know, it's the original manufacturer of the core material. It is the boat builder, it's the boat chandler, it is the people who own it. So, you know, that there is little acceptance by people owning boats that it should all fall on them. And that is something that we must take in. And when we're looking for solutions and when we're looking for funding, and I'm not in denial of anything that is being said here around the table, but I think that what has come out of yesterday's conference, that there appears to be a willingness to go into it together and see if we can come up with a solution before any legislation that is laid up from the top hits us.
Yep, thanks, Willem. How are we for time? Yeah. Shall I wrap up?
Yeah, let's do a wrap up.
If there's no more questions, firstly, I'd like to thank everybody for their questions. Thanks for coming along. It's really nice to have people interested in this subject. I hope you go away and talk to lots of other people about it, because it is very important for our industry. I made a few notes last night after the conference, and I think they apply today as well to the conclusions. Firstly, the costs of disposal are uniform, and I think that's very important. We have a pretty uniform price range across the disposal facilities in various countries, and they're not too high. They are livable if we can find the funding. We were delighted to see that GRP recycling is no longer mission impossible. I mean, a couple of years ago, we weren't even talking about recycling GRP composites. Now we are. There are ways of doing it. So that's positive. Legislation will come. We have to face that. Our industry already has it. But the trick for us is to be ahead of the curve, as as Albert pointed out earlier. It's probably going to come in 2018. We have to be ahead of the curve and work as an industry to make it right. To paraphrase our key speaker yesterday, Carla Di Maria, we have to join hands. We have to work together on this. I would say this because my business is PR, but I think we need a PR campaign. We need to turn around the psychology. We need to turn around the belief that this is a horror story. It's actually not such a horror story. It's not the end of the world if you have to dispose of your boat. You can even have a party on board and bring a few friends and make a leaving party. There's all kinds of things you can do. They're talking about organising leaving regattas. You know, why not? Let's turn around the psychology. We need a bit of a PR campaign. We need to get rid of the negative implications. And last but by no means least, we need creative funding schemes to kick this process, get this process kick-started. We do need to look around the industry, talk with our colleagues, find ways that we can create funding, because I think we've all agreed around this table and yesterday, you can say the last guy is the polluter, but he ain't going to pay. So we need to find somebody else who will. And the taxpayer certainly shouldn't pay. So thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated. Thank you.